All right, that news conference over in St. Petersburg, Florida is back up here. Again, they're talking about two separate cold cases, including a woman known as the Trunk Lady. That is a cold case murder from 1969. Let's pop up the audio and listen in live, raw, and unfiltered.
But in 1969, this was always known as the Trunk Lady case. Ironically, when we started doing the research, I wanted to find out if the original case detectives were still around. And I'd like to point out that Detective Paul Drolet, 87 years of age, sorry I called you out on that, but Paul is the original case detective in 1969 that worked on this case. This was his assignment, as well as several others that were there at the time. Bill Carlisle was the sergeant at the time, and they put a great deal of effort in trying to resolve this matter. I'm going to kind of read off a couple notes to stay on track, and then I'll go touch on a few other areas. So on Halloween Day, 1969, a little over 53 years ago, detectives and officers were sent out to the 4200 block of 32nd Street South. At the time, it was called the Oyster Bar. Now it's just a church that's located at that location. When they got there, they noticed this trunk that was in the field. Two juveniles observed two white male subjects pull up in a pickup truck, place the trunk into the field, and then leave. Officers arrived on scene. They opened up the trunk, and they found a body of a female inside the trunk, wrapped in plastic. One of the things, and it's totally different with investigative techniques now than then. Paul and his investigators, they were stuck with writing letters to agencies, to making phone calls to agencies, trying to find out who has a missing person, who has someone that could look is a demographic that would be similar to the female that we found that day in 1969. And after years of trying, it just never got any traction. Theories abound, and unfortunately, they never were able to identify them. In 2010, we wanted to start identifying some of our Jane Does and John Does. In this case, the victim was buried as a Jane Doe in the cemetery off of 49th Street up at the Kansas City Pinellas Park border, and there she was till 2010. In 2010, we had her exhumed. We attempted to get DNA from her remains. Unfortunately, that just didn't happen. It was too degraded, and again, the case went cold. Over the years, multiple different news outlets have touched upon it, and it was something that we just weren't able to think we were ever going to get any resolution on it. So late last year, earlier this year, the detectives in this case went through it again. And that is one of the things I want to highlight with the cold cases. It takes persistence. It takes going back and looking at things that may not have been available to individuals back in 1969, but more importantly, when we're looking at things in 2010, what could we have missed? And the detectives noticed that there was a section of hair that had not been tested, and we sent it to a private lab. When the hair sample was sent to the private lab, we were finally able to get a DNA profile. And that's only a step. That's a stepping stone on that. After we were able to get that DNA profile, Otham Labs was able to then run it through a DNA genealogy database. And after 53 years, the Trunk Lady finally has a name. We were able to do quite a bit of research as well through with the DNA hit, and we were able to locate some of her family members. So I'd like to point out, any longer the Trunk Lady. Her name is Sylvia June Atherton. Sylvia June Atherton, she was killed when she was 41 years of age. She left behind 5 children, and she was from the Tucson, Arizona area. One of the things that we've been able to stitch together is there are really no St. Petersburg ties. She left the Tucson area with a number of her children, had left 2 of them with a previous husband in Chicago, and then was never seen again by her children. We have her daughter Cylin on the Zoom today. She was a child when her mother went missing and had not known the whereabouts of her mother for the past 53 years. So through their investigative techniques, we were able to kind of get some of the names together. And this is more of a thing, we don't have the resolution on who killed her yet, This is where like amateur sleuths will come in. This is where we're asking for assistance to kind of put the pieces together and the gaps together. We do know that this trunk was their property. We do know that she was remarried. We do know that her husband at the time passed away in 1999 and never listed her as missing. We do know that he never listed her on any bankruptcy records. So you can see there's some inferences there that we have to kind of fill in the gaps. But mainly we wanted to bring forward the fact is she has a name now after 53 years. Her family does have the closure. And that's the closure that we're trying to bring forward. These are the steps, just like with Juicy's family. The closure that we need to bring forward, we may not always be able to bring an arrest forward, but we need to be able to show that we still care. And we need to be able to kind of bring forward our efforts on doing so. So I'll take a few questions. I know I kind of bounced around a little bit, and then we'll definitely I encourage, not only if you have any questions for the case detectives that picked it up, but Detective Roulette that came down, as well as family members that are here present, as well on Zoom, how you would like to break that down and how you'd like to be able to kind of touch on those cases.
When did St. Pete Police Department, your department specifically, in the missing persons, start using forensic testing?
So we've utilized mostly the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for the better half of a decade, if not a little bit longer. We started using the Pinellas County lab after that, because Pinellas County, we are fortunate to have our own lab here in Pinellas County. It does have some limitations. In this case is why we had to use a private lab, but for the most part, we have a phenomenal relationship not only with our lab locally here, but with also the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. So the better half of at least a decade or two that we've been able to utilize DNA testing, being able to kind of work through it. That wasn't always available, obviously, with the original case detectives in these cases.
And to the outside world, it may seem, well, why don't you just do testing, right? Why don't you just do DNA testing? Is it that easy or no?
For us to be able to send that information out, well, it shows you the challenge that we face, because when we exhumed the victim's body in 2010, it was too degraded at that time. We couldn't get DNA from any of the remains, so we were able to find one other section that we were able to kind of go in that direction. But you can see it's just not easy, especially with the older cases. DNA wasn't thought of. Preservation of evidence necessarily wasn't as well thought of on the way we do things today. We have touch DNA. We have regular DNA that comes through bodily fluids. 15, 20 years ago, that was never even thought of. And and if it was prohibited because we couldn't send it out to private labs to be able to do that. Now we're able to work with our partners here and be able to take care of that.
In the Richard Evans case, the fingerprint that you guys tied to the suspect in this case, was that fingerprint pulled when this was originally investigated or when it was recently revisited?
So it was pulled when it was originally investigated, but the suspect in this matter had not been arrested. So we didn't have a fingerprint to compare it to, and was not arrested until a number of years later, which is important. And that's one of the things I wanted to highlight, is because when the case goes cold, they may not get looked at again. So when the detectives are able to then pull back up, they're able to resubmit and go over evidence that somebody might have missed the first time or wasn't available for a DNA hit at that point, or a fingerprint hit in this case.
The genealogy test that the Texas lab uses, is that kind of like 23andMe, or like, what does that look like?
That was a question I was asking and trying to get resolution for. I wasn't exactly sure what genealogy. That's why I highlighted as Autumn Labs, but that's something we can get with you. I don't have that information. We were trying to figure that out on Friday, to be honest with you.
For sure, yeah, I just figured with all those popularity of those tests, people are just interested in like how you actually go down the path of.
I was too.
Yeah.
So that was one of the questions that I had too. So
So as a follow-up to that, would one of her family members need to have been in a database for them to locate a family member?
yes.
Obviously how that works.
So initially we had a DNA hit on her son, and we were able to find other family members, which is important too, because we've only found 2 of her family members. There are still 2 others we'd like to track down, her adult daughter and also the child that she had with her husband. We don't know the whereabouts of either one of them. It's difficult because you're trying to retrack something from 53 years ago, and it's not as easy as the Google searches as today. So marriages, changes, even name changes as we go, those are the tough parts that we need to kind of put together.
How many cold cases are currently open here within the department?
We average about 200 open murder cases that go back to the early 1960s. We have 3 or 4 missing persons cases, and then they also do touch upon some of the older sexual battery cases as well. That number has stayed consistent for the better half of 20 years. We usually are able to close, a few every year, and then we have had a really good closure rate with homicides the past 4 or 5 years. So luckily, those cases have not gone onto their desks, and they continue to work at the older cases. But that number has stayed stagnant. When I was a homicide detective, it was right around 206 to 212. I think we're about 220 right now.
How many are on that team working it?
The two of them. It's the two of them.
Hundreds of
That's what they do. That's what they do. That is what they do. They peel it back, and then during time with some of our other detectives, if they'd like to as invest some of the time in it as well, this is the opportunity. And these are the phases too where people can call in, because we never really had that. It was worked part-time. It was one of the cases that people would call in and you would just get a detective and say, okay, I'll try to dust the book off and see what I can do in between that. We've invested the resources in to be able to do that, and that's why we're able to bring some of this forward. Because at the point that you brought about the fingerprint on the bicycle, it may have stayed for another 10 years, and we would have known. If it hadn't been for pulling back and saying, listen, I need to take a minute, I need to look at something, did somebody miss something? And those are really what we need to do, because it's no fault of their own. Detectives retire, detectives move on, cases come in and we get hits later on. And if we don't have the ability to kind of look at that, it loses something. So they get to do that full time.
So this 15-year-old suspect was later incarcerated, and that's how his print came to be notified?
Correct. He was arrested for something later on, and that's how the print made it in the system.
Was he himself later a victim of a crime? Or
No,
causes?
it was natural causes. Correct. I shouldn't say natural, but something that was not homicidal. All right. Well, good. Well, I appreciate it. What I'd like for everybody to do is please take a moment. I don't know how Yolanda, if you could please come up, you best to do it. We can even have somebody go in the side room if we need to. But I encourage Detective Drolette came down. He lives in Clearwater now. Came down, and he would love to be able to talk about it. We have Juicy's family here, and then Sylvan is on the Zoom, and I'll let Yolanda try to figure out the best way to handle that.
I think we can start with the Zoom interview with Sylvan Gates. She's coming to us from California, and we have the technology working right now, so I think it would be a good idea to talk to her first, and then we'll talk to Juicy's family afterwards. Okay, so Sylvan, they can see and hear you. So I'm going to have, if any of the reporters would like to ask a question, go ahead.
Hi, Sylvan. My name is Vanessa Ariza. I'm with ABC here in Tampa. Just for the record, could you spell your first and last name for all of us, please?
Sure. Celine, S as in Sam, Y, L-L-E-N, last name James, J-T-E-S. Did you hear me?
Yes, we're trying to get better clarity to hear you. Is there a malt box or?
Yeah, we're trying to.
The speakers just come out through here. Do you guys want to use your? Or come
Okay, Sylvan, we're going to try to put the microphone to the TV so that they can hear you. So please bear with us, Sylvan. We've never done this before in a live press conference, so we're all kind of learning from this.
Thank you.
I think they've got it. So we can just ask you if you don't mind speaking up too, because that will help with the speakers.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, is that better, guys?
Do those speakers go any louder?
Can you hear me better? I can speak up a little bit if that helps.
That does help. That does help quite a bit.
Okay. Shall I spell my name one more time?
No,